All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining our webinar today, Protect the Digital Kingdom, Why Availability is the New Security Imperative. I'm Corey Stowe. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Alliances here with Corero Network Security. And I'm joined with my colleague, Raj Vadi, who is the Senior Solutions Architect. Just quickly, you will going through a lot of things. First of all, we'll just talk a little bit about each of our backgrounds a little bit to to illustrate sort of why we're here, why what we say kind of has some background to it. We've experienced this. We have the scars. So before joining Corero, I worked for Bell Canada, where I ran the cybersecurity practice for Bell Canada. So I'm intimately aware of all of the challenges from a service provider perspective, a telecommunications perspective on both sides of the network and security problem, as well as I sold security solutions to enterprises all the time, whether it's on premise, whether it's in the cloud, whether it's network based, etc. So that's my background super quickly. Raj, what about you?
Sure. Thank you, Corey. And I've been in the field of network and application security for well over, like, I think, about 25 years. Worked with my previous employer was also in the same space in terms of network security, application security. Now, with Corero. So that's basically kind of been my background, working with a variety of industries, from banking and financial institutions to other enterprises, including manufacturing. Thank you.
Cool. Awesome. Great introduction, Raj. So Raj, today we're talking about how we protect the digital kingdom and how availability is the new security imperative. But I wanted to double click a little bit on that. When we say digital kingdom, right? I know what I have in my head, but can you describe, the digital kingdom, what that is today and why it matters?
Yeah, so I mean, basically what we are talking about, the digital kingdom, is really the domain, your enterprise. Like, when you do your business online, and today pretty much everything is online, right? So it's talking about the connectivity, right? Like, your WAN links and various different stuff, your infrastructure in terms of switching and routing. We're talking about things, critical services like DNS, right? Because this is what resolves all your names to IP addresses and so on and so forth. We're talking about applications that are running within your data center or maybe in the cloud, depends on where you're hosted. But put together, right, in an abstract sense, this is your digital kingdom because these are your assets and this is where you conduct your business.
Awesome. And so, speaking of business, you and I have been in a ton of customer and partner conversations lately. You and I work very closely together. Whenever we go into a customer or a partner, security discussions seem to converge on availability, business continuity discussions very quickly. From your technical perspective, has availability effectively become a security outcome?
Yes, I think I strongly believe in that. Typically when we approach the security construct from the three parts, which is like, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I think, like, a few years ago, clearly things like confidentiality, and this is how TLS, SSL, everything else came into place, because all of the data was clear text, right, and ripe for exploitation. And therefore, it was about kind of protecting the confidentiality of information. And then came through, various different types of integrity, whether it was like, in terms of like your various software and things to detect any kind of like modified or malicious, content and so on and so forth. But I think like availability was always somewhat, not paid as much attention in the past. But I think in the past 5-6 years, this has become a critical thing, right? Absolutely. Because if people can't get to you, it doesn't matter what security you have. So yeah, I think like, when we look at this stuff, availability or attacks that target availability have become a primary security concern.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree.
So, we've talked about the digital kingdom. We've talked about a little bit about the availability, but given your background, your interactions, and more from the business side of
Mhm.
things, what do you feel, Corey, is like how does it change how business leaders see this? Because ultimately all of these things are funded, and whether it
Yeah.
is a process perspective, business leaders have to be engaged.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, from a business perspective, a business leader perspective, it fundamentally reframes success, right? So business leaders, they don't experience security through dashboards or alerts or even incidents, necessarily, right? They experience it through whether the business continues to function, right? Can my customers still engage with me, right? Can my partners still engage with me? And when these services go down, right, revenue stops, customers notice, brand takes a hit, consumer confidence or partner confidence erodes
You
very,
may
very.
even have churn, right, in terms of
You
this.
might even have churn as a result of this, right? So when availability then becomes the lens, right, security effectiveness is no longer about how many threats were detected and blocked, right? Which is obviously important. It's important for everybody. I'm sure everybody on the call is like, yeah, but yeah, it is totally important, right? But it's about whether the critical services remained available during those times, right? Because we could stop every attack, coming into my environment, but at the end of the day, if my customers can interact with the applications that are stored at my site or in my data center or in that cloud, that's a bigger problem, right? And that's a much more tangible, outcome-driven way for executives to evaluate security, right?
So do you see like availability is kind of become like the bridge between technical security controls, like whatever implementations and things like that, and how business risk is assessed, or basically how do you manage that whole business risk?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's the common language that binds security teams, the network teams, and the executive leadership, right? Each team, each group has their own set of KPIs, those all those things that they matter to them. But at the end of the day, they all funnel back up towards, does my service, is it available? Is it effective? Is it efficient? Is it operating at its peak performance? And more importantly, can my organization continue business at its desired state, right?
Mhm.
But you know that begs the question, right? From a technical and attacker behavior standpoint, right? Why is availability such a preferred target today?
That's a very interesting question, right? I mean, typically when we've looked at like all the security solutions, I mean, people are always aware of things like, hey, we need a firewall, we need like, an IDS, an IPS, and all of these things. And, again, going back to the security focus and conversation in the past, right? These are all on things like intrusions, the confidentiality, integrity parts. And honestly, the threats, a majority of these threats were back then targeting those confidentiality and integrity. They may not have been, heavy in traffic or volume, but they also needed a certain level of sophistication in order to understand, your applications or programs or vulnerabilities within operating systems in order to exploit, right? And so as things moved along, first and foremost, I think like, in the last 10, 15, maybe 20 years, right? Broadband has become very inexpensive and accessible, extremely accessible, right? Everybody has access to broadband. And essentially, this gives you a channel to send a volumetric attack. In the past, it may have been a few number of players who had that kind of bandwidth, right, to target entities. But now, anybody with a cable modem, and more importantly, I think the rise of the botnets, right? There's a lot of compromised systems out there at homes with broadband that can be commanded to launch these attacks on behalf of the attackers. So first, I think, the environment and the connectivity, the broadband has definitely changed how these attacks are carried out. Number two, it requires relatively less sophistication, because the idea here is either, in the first place, the most crudest ones is simply stuff the pipe, right? Just send so much of traffic that the endpoint, the WAN links are overrun. And the higher levels of that stuff would target applications behaving like a regular browser or client, whatever it is, but simply abusing, asking the same question repeatedly, multiple times, and trying to generate essentially junk traffic, even though it's legitimate. There's nothing from a signature perspective that you could detect, right? And even rate, how do you, rate limit maybe, but distinguishing what is legitimate, what is not, makes a difference. But I think, that's been, primarily from a technical perspective, why availability attacks have become effective. Because, if you shut down the door, then nobody else can get in, right? Mm-hmm. And these guys are trying to take down either the application or the pipe itself, right? If you fill up the WAN link, nobody can enter. And now your digital kingdom is under siege.
And it's easy these days, right? Yes. Meaning, when
technology
I was in my prior life, we had there was one scenario where there was students that were actually taking down a whole school and a whole school system, and as a result of everybody using the Google-based products, that nobody could do any work because nobody could actually access the cloud, the cloud work, right? So if students in elementary school can launch a DDoS attack, I think that goes and shows you how simple it is to do, right?
Right.
And on the business side, right, that that disruption is it's immediate, right? It has an immediate impact on your own business outcomes, right? And something that obviously businesses want to avoid, right?
Absolutely. And so this is exactly why these availability attacks are effective, right? Because they translate very quickly into business impact. By the way, if you were to use a ROI kind of analogy, right, for the little amount of things that you can do to generate these very massive volumetric attacks, just think about taking sites down, right? I mean, it's an outage. And we've seen even very large scalable entities, cloud providers, cloud services, all being subject to these kind of attacks. I don't know if you remember, Brian Krebs, a few years ago, he was basically wiped out under a massive DDoS, right? Yeah. So yes, I would say these are very effective because they definitely, impact businesses. Now, Corey, you work with a lot of organizations that have made substantial investments in security, right? And, why doesn't that kind of translate into protecting availability? What has been, because there's a lot of money that has been spent.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, lots of money has been spent, across the board. And you mentioned a few of them, earlier on, like firewalls and IPS and, all those kind of traditional things. And the answer is because, why isn't that, doesn't automatically, go to protect availability, is because most of those investments were made to solve a different problem, right? Mm-hmm. Traditional security models, and if we go back to the way we think about the title of this, right, was protect the digital kingdom. Well, in my mind, I think of back in the day, security was, I'm going to build a moat around my kingdom, right? And the only inner way out, other than climbing the 60-foot, concrete walls or block walls, was a drawbridge, right? So I had to, me as inside the kingdom would have to let whoever was coming down by, lowering the drawbridge and have those people come in, right? And so, if we think about that in a security perspective, right, think of that drawbridge as your firewall, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that's great. And it was very easy to control back in the day, right? But what happens if I have hundreds and thousands of horse and carriages coming through, whether they're good or bad for that matter. But if the people that can't do, commerce with my kingdom, right, that's a gigantic problem, right? So, security models were built around this concept of this moat defense, right? Around perimeter defense, detection, and then investigation, right? And they all assumed that there was always going to be time to analyze the situation, escalate it to whoever needed to be escalated to, and then ultimately respond, right?
Mm-hmm.
But availability attacks, they compress that timeline dramatically, right? And then when services are degraded in real time, the businesses, they can't wait for a ticket to be opened or a playbook to be followed, or have 3 teams sort of engaged to actually do something. Mm-hmm. So despite having, very strong security tooling, organizations still experience these type of outages because the tools were never designed to keep services running under, sustained attacks, and certainly not, at the volumes we're seeing today, right?
Yeah.
And so,
makes sense.
but in my mind, there's a technical limitation, right? And from an architecture perspective, Raj, right? Like, what's the technical limitation?
Right. So, I think like some of the controls and like implementations that came out pretty much adopted similar methodologies as the previous things that we discussed, right? Like, so if we talk about signature-based protection for a DDoS, that's more effective from an IPS, IDS kind of perspective, right? But, with DDoS attacks, there isn't really, sometimes, for example, like we talked about, it could be illegitimate traffic. So how do you write a signature that blocks, what looks like a legitimate request, right? So it's not something necessarily malicious in that request, in that packet, whatever it is. So signature, I think these were some of the implementations that were attempting to use signatures. They don't necessarily fit, at least not the traditional way signatures were done, where you're looking at specific patterns, right? The other part involved also using like, if it exceeds X amount of, connections or bandwidth, I'm going to discard the excess traffic. Here's the problem, right? Even when you're under attack, you still have legitimate traffic. Yeah. How do you distinguish?
Totally true.
If you put just a rate limit and you're discarding, you might be discarding legitimate, customers. So at the end of the day, you're investing in a technical solution, but it's not providing the kind of availability, resilience that you expect these things to. So those were some of the issues. The other thing is obviously there's always the cloud provided DDoS protections, right? And this could be even like the carrier provided, like, your last link where you get your WAN links from, and so on and so forth. And while they're good, some of the initial things involved also manual steps. It's like you had to reach out to your carrier and say, hey, I'm under attack. Can you divert my traffic? Things have improved. There's more automation involved out there. But still, all of this takes time, right? In the meantime, your applications are down, right?
Yeah, and certainly if mitigation depends on human decision making, right, or any sort of delayed orchestration, right? Availability is by definition already compromised.
Totally, right? So this, and I think that's where like technology needs to be something that's inline, able to like inspect traffic at very high volumes and speeds, right? And take instantaneous decisions, near real time, ability to block, to minimize any downtime, outage, or misuse of the resources. And in fact, I think if it is, sub-second kind of things, generally it might show up as a blip in terms of the resource utilization, but very quickly would be mitigated. And, all of your resources, access, everything else is available, and therefore preserves that availability. But I think that these have been some of the technical limitations in terms of handling it.
And certainly, right, like if an organization has the ability to detect and mitigate sub-second, right, I mean, that definitely, goes a long way to help their continuity and their availability, right? But not everybody has that, and modern attacks today, they specifically exploit that gap between when I detect something or how I detect something, how long that takes, and then how long again does it take before I do anything with it, right? Assuming that I can do something with it, right? So you describe a little bit about how modern attacks specifically exploit that gap between detection and availability.
Absolutely. So, and you hit the nail on the head. Like in terms of like when you look at this detection and then mitigation kind of cycle, uh, especially when we're looking at very large enterprises, clouds, and so on and so forth, because there are many entry points and things like that. Um, it's it takes time to get this data, and typically I think the tool that had been used, or maybe I shouldn't say tool, but the data was based upon net flows, and these are generally aggregated reports. By the way, the net flow was never created for availability or anything. It was observability of the network, right?
Yep.
Which is still a very important part of this whole thing in terms of being able to observe the network, but it's not going to be the tool you use to mitigate these attacks. And the nature of that involved a certain amount of lag before something was detected and before it was mitigated. However, the modern day attacks, what they do is they play with that lag. So an attack may start off in a certain manner or a certain vector, and within 5 minutes shift to a different type of attack. So this way the lag never catches up, and it's a persistent attack. In the meantime, the businesses are suffering an outage. It's an impact to that business. There's also many different attacks that are being simultaneously being targeted towards these resources. So I think like, clearly even the security tools have to be evolved to handle these kind of like, pulse attacks and persistent attacks,
Right.
Effectively.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and I, as a result, right? I mean, it makes it very hard for organizations to explain what actually happened, right? I mean, we talk about observability, but with all of those things going on at once, right? It's really hard for organizations to explain what happened.
Right. And this is very difficult topic because there's organizations who have sunk a lot of money into their security infrastructure and architecture. But what has happened is, over the years, this has organically grown into X, Y, and Z. And yet, architecturally, this was never designed with availability as the primary purpose in mind, right? It was always about confidentiality, integrity, is my VPN there, X, Y, and Z. And this is also some of the other stuff that you need to take care of, right? Like, access control and, how do you kind of be proactive about that? Or, even observability, right? Like, because if you have a very complex network, not only do you want to provide availability, but are you optimizing your particular infrastructure, right? Are you using these pathways correctly? So I think like, from an organizational perspective, I mean, technically I can say like, look, sometimes you just need to scratch it and redesign from the start, ground up, right?
Yeah.
Not always practically possible, but, you do need to rethink how your architecture is in place and maybe at least adjust some critical portions. I know tearing down and starting is not really an option in most cases. So,
Totally.
Yeah, I think that's basically what it is. But I mean, if we are looking at availability as the outcome that we really want to care about,
Yeah.
And I will present this to you because again, I know technically I can say just repeat and replace, but since you have dealt with business leaders and you have been in a career and you have faced these challenges in the
Right.
past,
Yep.
how should organizations face this? How should they design their environment, or maybe even process and policy, right? How to cope with this changing environment?
Yeah, well, it means shifting from a reactive mindset, right? So I'm going to deal with something as it comes, and I have all this business, process and whatever orchestration and all this stuff as a
Mhm.
result of something happening, to an engineered one. And what I mean by that is, like, organizations need to assume the attacks will happen, right? And build and design systems that can absorb them, right? And withstand them without interrupting services, right? So what that means is that, they need to put the availability, the business continuity, the resiliency, the business resiliency as part of, if not the lead element around their entire program, right?
Mhm.
And from a leadership perspective, that's a strategic decision, right? It affects everything. It affects the architecture, like you said, investment priority, ownership models, right? We talked a little bit about this already, but whether it's network operations, whether it's security operations, whether it's security incident handling, whether it's whatever cyber threat intelligence groups, whether whoever, right? They need to build those programs, intentionally, to protect service availability, business continuity, and build business continuity, right? It has
Mhm.
to be intentional, right? It cannot be incidental. And certainly, as all of us, rely so heavily on connectivity and keeping our systems up, this no longer really becomes any question whether or not it's just strategic is a strategic thing that we need to do as business leaders, right? It's
Mhm.
more about, how am I going to do it? How am I going to do it cost effectively, and in what priority, right? And really, that's really what it comes down to, right? But it's got to be a conscious decision to make business continuity and business resiliency the number
Mhm.
one priority, for which everything else falls down from.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right.
Mhm.
And technically, this means a lot of different things, right? So from a technical perspective, Raj, right?
Mhm.
Um, what could enable this kind of resilience?
So technically, again, as I said, like we did go through the architecture stuff. A redesign is certainly not possible. Then one must think about, like, in terms of what is the pipeline, right? In terms of your connectivity, where's the traffic coming from? What's the whole pathways? So first, I would say, as a security expert, I will always talk about security in layers, right? So which actually gives a good pathway to re-architecting, so you can still retain all your security investments but augment it at the right position in the network, typically around the perimeter, right? In terms of inline devices, inline protection, I mean, it could be device, I say device, but logical function, let's say,
Yeah.
from an inline perspective. And what do I mean by inline? What I mean by inline is every single packet that traverses a particular link, a particular site, whatever, would be inspected by this, function, and examined: is it good, malicious, bad, etc. Obviously, it can also have preceded intelligence, right? When we talk about things like, I don't know, some kind of a feed for malicious source IP addresses, like, these particular networks. For example, I am not sure, being in North America, why there would be a genuine business purpose for receiving traffic from North Korea, right? Things
Yeah.
like that. So these are things that need to be implemented. So the idea again is security in layers, but also kind of filtering in layers, right? So you want to filter out all the unwanted traffic, and then be able to inspect packet by packet so that you can make a decision quick, right? This is the key. We talked about that whole lag where these attacks can morph, adapt, or be a multi-vector. And if it takes too long, then you're going to suffer outages, right, before you can react. So this needs to be
Right.
very quick. Be able to immediately pick up the malicious traffic, discard that stuff, right? But also, I think it is important to understand what is happening because, again, in terms of audit, remember, like a lot of these organizations may require to provide information about any security incidents. That's part of the compliance regulations, right? So you need to have data: what was mitigated, what were the attack, who were the attackers, or what were they trying to attack, etc. So I think visibility is also very important part of not only taking the primary means of protecting your assets, but also understanding what happened, generate that information so that you can present and report upon that. Also protecting within the kingdom assets like, which allow your own employees remote access. I don't know, it could be like VPN gateways and things like that. So some sort of a protection and access control kind of thing. But more importantly, I think if you're looking at services, nowadays almost every single service is enabled through HTTPS, TLS, encrypted traffic. So these solutions need to be able to examine that traffic also for volumetric and those kind of attacks. Again, I would say security in layers. So you take out all the bulk attacks, even if they are encrypted, and then more fine-grained, whatever your intrusions. That's it. Again, different part within your network. But that's the way I would look at to provide resilience.
Right. Cool. And just briefly, like, when you talk about in layers, right? A hybrid approach to resiliency, right, is also what you're talking about there when you're in layers, right? And for me, from my perspective, being my carrier background, right, a hybrid is a combination of either cloud and on-premise. In this case, we're talking service availability protection. So whether it's cloud and on-premise gear, or whether or not your upstream element is provided by your provider, assuming that they do a decent job doing that, then those two elements, cloud on-premise, network on-premise, is really the multi-layer that we're talking about, specifically with availability. No,
I think so. I totally think so. Like, it has to be, again, yes, absolutely, the pipeline, right? As I said. Yeah. So from the origin to your destination, we need to have controls at various places.
Right. Yeah.
Now, again, I know like the technical answer to this stuff, right? But, when you deal with organization, because maybe it's the responsibilities or how things are split up, but where do you think that they struggle most when it comes to things like availability and resilience, to minimize their business impact?
Ownership and accountability as a general statement, from the hundreds of companies, thousands perhaps, that I've worked with over the years, and it all comes down to ownership and accountability, right? Availability and business continuity often sits between groups like security, networking, operations, data center, whoever has elements of it, right? And they all have elements of it, right? The security team will look at the incidents, right? The networking team will look at network performance and potential causes for that. And the operations team then will actually stick handle the actual, fingers on keyboard changes and profile changes, configuration changes that may or may not have to happen in response to something, right? Mm-hmm. But this means that no single group is ultimately responsible for the outcome. And if we start thinking about this as outcomes and not just tasks that each group has to fulfill, now we start to understand that no, there has to be somebody, some person, some group that has to have ultimate accountability for resolving and maintaining these successful outcomes, right? Mm-hmm. So when something goes wrong, of course, without that, right, when something goes wrong, response slows down, decision making becomes fragmented. And, leaders need to really start to treat availability as the business risk, that it is, right? With clear ownership, metrics, governance, right? So ownership, means that,
so something like a supreme commander, like, I'm taking a World War II analogy, right? Yeah. Put all everybody's trying to work towards the same objective, but everyone has a different mission, and somebody needs to have an overarching responsibility and ownership.
That's right. And you know what? It's not just the spear or the chain, protector for me as an individual, right? It's all the processes around it, right? How am I going to orchestrate the myriad of organizations under my control to actually deal with this problem in a coordinated way, right? This needs to be repeatable, right? It can't just be heroics, right? This needs to be instantiated as a way of doing business, right?
Right.
And so in order to do that, yeah, you need accountability, like you said, but you need metrics. You need to be able to observe, right? Observability is a really key thing here, right? We need to be able to observe. We need to be able to measure. And now we need to be able to take action either through individuals or through an overlaying, governance structure.
And do it fast.
And of course, do it fast, right? Just like any other critical risk. And maybe this one's even more critical because this one has a clear impact on anything downstream, right? If customers can't actually get to you, it doesn't really matter what else happens, right? At that point, right? So if that doesn't happen from a technical standpoint, what's the consequence, Raj, of not doing that?
Yeah, so I mean, the consequence of not doing this is essentially like, as you stated, for example, a lot of organizations may have a posture of security policy, but it means different things to different people, especially when it is not coordinated, when there is no single source of truth. And the problem is, it's like, I think there was this, the way they look at it is they're only seeing a part of the problem. And therefore, they may take some individual action, which doesn't translate into effective, protection. So there's going to be inconsistent protection, right?
Yeah,
And, a good example may be things like some of these malicious sources. And maybe they are like, trying to get into your VPN server or whatever it is. But here's the question. If they're already attempting malicious activities, do you want these IP addresses accessing other stuff? They should be, right? I mean, if you're only looking at the VPN side and not preventing these from getting anywhere into your network, makes no sense. Again, that does require some kind of coordinated stuff, right? Second thing is, if you have different groups with their own responsibility structure, how do they communicate, right? Overall, by the time it gets out and you get the other groups involved, it's going to be a slow response, right? It's not quick, coordinated, and action-led plan. And the result is pretty clear, right? It's going to cause longer outages, right, and more impact to the business. And I'll just say this, right, from a business perspective, that's going to be an uncomfortable, conversation that the business leaders will have with their boards or whoever else they need to talk to.
Yeah, I've been in those. I've been part of those conversations before, man. That is not fun. That is not fun stuff. So, as much as we can try and help organizations avoid those, those uncomfortable discussions, as you say, right. That's essentially our main goal, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, as we go forward, right, organizations really need to redefine security success as, whether or not these critical services remain available while under attack, right? And if these systems stay online, customers remain unaffected, and then the security has achieved its purpose, right? Which brings us back to the core message, right? Availability isn't just part of security anymore.
It is security, right? I mean, availability is security. And, basically, I would think like, just to ensure that the success is achieved is number one, I think procedurally, policy-wise, as you stated, right? I think it is very key for business leaders to put forth a policy that prioritizes availability, understands that there needs to be investments made in availability, and sets also like parameters, as you stated, right? It is like what are critical services that need to be up. And on an annual basis, what is the maximum amount of downtime that I can tolerate from as a business perspective as part of your business continuity plan, time to recovery, and so on and so forth, right? But incorporate it into that. And, I think like, at the end of the day, your bottom line is going to be the best metric, right? Because if you're going to have outages, your bottom line is going to be affected. So I think availability is security, and essentially these are the keys to the digital kingdom, right? I mean, this is, I think, one of the most key asset that needs to be protected. Your pathways to the digital kingdom, if they're clogged, unavailable, cut off, bridges broken, nobody can get in. So these are critical assets that need to be protected from an availability perspective. and made into policy, measured against, and most importantly, as you said, ownership and responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So listen, so thanks everybody for joining today. We talked a lot about the business elements around business continuity and business resiliency, along with a lot of the technical elements of that. Raj and I are always available. You can reach out to us on LinkedIn. We're always available and enjoy having these types of conversations. And whether it's service availability, whether it's any other security domain, both Raj and I love to have those discussions. So feel free to reach out to us individually. The Corero team, just in general, you can also reach out to any one of us, any one of the broader team as well. We love having those discussions, and we're always willing and more than willing to actually help drive successful business outcomes for our clients. So thanks again, everybody, and we look forward to next time.
Yep. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.